Imagine this. You are standing on the bank of a great river on a warm summer evening. The Volga is carrying its waters to the Caspian Sea. And somewhere in the distance, in the golden haze of sunset, the lights of a city that no longer exists flicker. The city whose name was known from Constantinople to Baghdad, from Kiev, princely terems, to Chinese imperial palaces. Itil, the capital of the empire, which disappeared so without a trace that even archaeologists still argue where exactly it stood. And in this silence of the evening shore, we will take a journey to one of the most mysterious pages of world history. The history of the Khazar Khaganate, a state that 7 centuries ago controlled the lands from the Dnieper to the Caspian Sea, and which disappeared into time, leaving only vague echoes in chronicles and rare coins in museum showcases. Greetings, my dear listeners, and I invite you to write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is, because history knows no borders, and wherever you are, it unites us in this quiet evening reflection on the past. Close your eyes and mentally transport yourself back to the 7th century AD. The world was different then, brighter in colors, more pungent in smells, slower in movement. On the steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea roamed tribes whose horses kicked up dust for thousands of miles, and whose winds carried the smell of wormwood and fires. It was here, on these boundless expanses, where the sky touches the earth and the horizon dissolves in the dawn, that the empire of the Khazars was born. Khazars. The word itself sounds like a whisper of wind in the steppe grass. They came from the east, from the depths of Asia, as one of the waves of that great migration of peoples, which for centuries redrew the map of Eurasia. Turkic nomads, they carried with them the memory of the vast steppes, of life under the starry sky, of freedom that could only be measured by the distance your horse traveled before sunset. Imagine a rider on a low but hardy steppe horse. His clothes are simple but practical: a leather jacket, a felt hat, a crooked saber, and a bow at his belt. He knows where to find water in the waterless steppe, can read the stars, and feel the approach of bad weather by the behavior of his horse. This man is the heir of traditions that go back thousands of years, traditions of the steppe where only the strong, intelligent, and united survive. Khazars were not a homogeneous people. As a river collects the waters of many tributaries, so the Khazar Union absorbed various tribes and clans. There were descendants of the ancient Savirs, Iranian-speaking peoples who settled in the foothills of the Caucasus, local tribes whose roots went back to prehistoric times. All of them gradually fused into a single nation under the rule of the Khazar Khagans, creating that amazing mosaic of cultures that would become the hallmark of the future empire in the middle of the 7th century, while the Prophet Muhammad was preaching in distant Arabia and Byzantine emperors in Constantinople were plotting the return of lost lands, events that would determine the fate of Eastern Europe for centuries were taking place in the Black Sea steppes. The great Turkic Khaganate, that gigantic state stretching from the Chinese borders to the Black Sea, began to disintegrate under the weight of its own size and internal contradictions. It was then that the Khazars asserted themselves as an independent force. They separated from the West Turkic Khaganate not as a result of a bloody war, but rather as a natural consequence of the fact that the central power had weakened and could no longer control remote territories. The Khazars were in the right place at the right time. They controlled strategically important territories between the seas, through which the most important trade routes passed. The first serious test for the young Khazar state was a meeting with the Bulgarian Association, known in history as the Great Bulgaria. Imagine this meeting. Two mighty nomadic forces converge somewhere in the Azov steppes. Dust column rises to the sky. You can hear the stomping of thousands of hooves, ringing of weapons, shouts of warriors. The air is filled with the smell of sweat of horses and men, leather and metal. This is not just a battle. It is a clash of two ways of life, two ideas of who owns the steppe. The Khazars won. This victory was not just a military success. It symbolically passed them the baton of domination in the Eastern European steppes. The Bulgarians partly went to the west, where they founded the Bulgarian kingdom on the Danube, partly remained under the rule of the Khazars, partly retreated to the north, in the Volga region, where they created the Volga Bulgaria. And the Khazars took the place of the main power between the Black and Caspian seas. But the most amazing thing in the history of the Khazar Khaganate began a little later, when from the south, from behind the Caucasus Mountains, a new, formidable force appeared. The Arabs. Imagine these soldiers of Islam, filled with religious fervor, accustomed to victories, conquered Persia and Syria, besieged Constantinople itself. They marched northwards, bringing with them a new faith and a new way of life. And it seemed that nothing could stop their advance into the interior of Europe. It was here, in the foothills of the Caucasus, that one of those historical encounters that determined the fate of continents took place. The Khazars stood in the way of Arab expansion. It was a confrontation not just of two armies, but of two worlds, the world of the steppe and the world of the desert, the world of ancient Turkic traditions and the world of young Islamic civilization. Wars with the Arabs lasted for decades. Imagine these campaigns. An Arab army moves through mountain passes, warriors in white robes, on fast horses, accustomed to the sand of the deserts, but hardly tolerating the cold of the mountain peaks. The Khazars, riders in leather armor, who know every path, every hiding place in these lands, are coming down from the north to meet them. One of the most dramatic episodes of this confrontation was the campaign of the 730th year, when the Khazar Tsarevich Barjil, son of the Khagan, made a daring raid far to the south. Imagine this picture. The Khazar army suddenly appears under the walls of Ardabil, one of the most important cities of the South Caucasus. The Arabs did not expect such audacity. In the battle that followed, 25,000 Arab warriors fell in battle. It was one of the most painful losses the Arabs ever suffered in their campaigns of conquest. But the Arabs knew how to learn from their defeats. 7 years later, in the year 737, the great Arab commander Marwan, nicknamed Deaf because of his ability to ignore pleas for mercy, launched a retaliatory campaign. It was no longer a raid, but an invasion. A huge army marched northwards, sweeping away everything in its path. The Khazars retreated using scorched earth tactics. They took with them cattle, burned grass, filled wells. The Arabs marched across the desert steppe, where there was nothing to feed the horses and nothing for people to eat. But Marwan was persistent. He reached the very capital of the Khazars, the city of Semender, which stood somewhere in the foothills of Dagestan, and took it. However, the victory proved to be Pyrrhic. The Arabs could not hold these lands. They were too far from their bases, too alien to the local population. The Khazars did not submit. They took refuge in the swamps of the Volga Delta, waited it out, and when the Arabs left, they returned and restored their power. Moreover, these wars brought them an unexpected benefit. They forced the Khazars to rethink their strategy, to shift the center of gravity of the state from the dangerous southern borders to the safer northern regions. It was then, in the 8th century, that Eitel, the new capital of the Khazars, a city that would become one of the largest trading centers of the early medieval world, emerged in the lower reaches of the Volga. Imagine this place. The wide river overflows with many channels, forming countless islands. On one of them, protected by water better than any fortress walls, a city emerges. At first, it is yurts and wooden houses, then brick buildings, palaces of rulers, merchants' warehouses, craftsmen's workshops. The air here is saturated with odors: fish from the Seine, leather from the workshops, spices from the camel caravans, smoke from the smithies. People in different clothes, walk along the streets. Khazar warriors in chainmail, Arab merchants in white dressing gowns, Slavic guests in embroidered shirts, Jewish traders in long kaftans. A motley of languages sounds: Turkic Khazar, Arabic, Slavic, Jewish, Greek. This is not just a city. It is a window between worlds, a place where east and west, north and south meet. The Khazar state gradually took the forms that would make it unique in history. There was a remarkable system of dual power, which had no analogues in the medieval world. At the head of the state formally stood the Kagan, a sacred figure surrounded by a complex ritual. His power was considered divine, and the prosperity of the whole country depended on his health and well-being. But the real power belonged to the Bek, a military commander and administrator who managed all earthly affairs. Imagine this picture. In an opulent palace, surrounded by respectful courtiers, sits the Kagan. His clothes are sewn with gold, a precious crown on his head. But he hardly speaks, makes no decisions. His life is subject to a strict ritual. And in the neighboring building, in his office, surrounded by maps and papers, the Bey, the real ruler of the country, receives ambassadors and decides state affairs. This system did not arise by chance. It made it possible to combine the ancient steppe traditions of sacral authority with the practical needs of governing a complex, multi-ethnic state. Khazaria became an increasingly complex organism. Its territory stretched from the Dnieper in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east, from the foothills of the Caucasus in the south to the forest zone in the north. These were lands with completely different natural conditions, different peoples, different traditions. Khazar clans roamed with their herds in the southern steppes. Alans were engaged in agriculture and viticulture in the foothills of the Caucasus. Slavic tribes hunted and gathered honey in the forest zone. Byzantine Greeks traded in the cities of the Crimea. All this diversity had to be united somehow to create a system that would allow such different people to live under one authority. The Khazars found a surprisingly wise solution. They did not try to equalize everyone, did not force them to adopt Khazar customs. Instead, they created a system that can be called federal. Each nation retained its own structure, its own leaders, its own traditions, but paid tribute to the Khazar Khagan and recognized his supreme authority. This system worked because the Khazars did not just collect tribute, they gave protection and order in return. Khazar garrisons stood at key points: in the fortress of Sarkel on the Don, in Samkarets near the Kerch Strait, In other strategically important places, they guarded trade routes, stopped feuds, provided the stability without which prosperity is impossible. But the most amazing thing in the Khazar history was how this steppe empire developed religious diversity, which had no analogues in the medieval world. Imagine a morning in Eitel. Golden rays of the sun break through the morning mist over the Volga, and in this soft light, you can see the silhouettes of completely different temples and sanctuaries. Here, on one island, next to each other, stand a Christian church with a wooden cross on the dome, a mosque with an elegant minaret, a synagogue with a modest facade, and a little further away, an ancient sanctuary with a tree worshipped by the descendants of steppe nomads. The air here is filled with an amazing mixture of sounds. Christian bells ringing somewhere for the morning service. The muezzin's call comes from the mosque. In the synagogue, morning prayers are recited. And at the sacred tree, a shaman mumbles incantations, addressing the spirits of ancestors. And all this does not create a cacophony. The sounds merge into a strange but harmonious symphony, symbolizing what Khazaria was, a meeting place of worlds, cultures, and beliefs. Initially, the Khazars, like most steppe peoples, worshipped Tengri, the great sky god who reigned over the vast steppe. It was a religion of open spaces, where the main temple was the dome of the sky, and the main priests were shamans who could read the signs in the flight of birds, in the patterns of clouds, in the sound of wind in the grass. The Khazars had sacred trees, mighty oaks or steppe poplars, which grew near springs or on ancestral mounds. They came to these trees with requests for rain, for the health of livestock, for victory over enemies. But as Khazaria became an increasingly complex state, in contact with other civilizations, the religious picture began to become more complex. From the south, from Byzantium and Transcaucasia, came Christianity. Imagine the first Christian preachers in the Khazar lands. They walked on foot on the steppe roads, stopped at nomads, told about Christ to people who were used to worship the forces of nature. It was not an easy task. How to explain to a nomad who had spent his life in the open air that God could live in a stone building? How do you talk about loving your enemies to those for whom war was part of everyday life? And yet, Christianity took root in the Khazar land. Already in the 7th century, one of the Khazar vassal rulers, Alp Ilitwer, was baptized. Byzantine emperors saw in the Christianization of the Khazars an important political task. After all, a Christian Khazaria would be a natural ally of Byzantium against the Islamic world. They sent missionaries, built churches, gifted Khazar rulers with precious icons and church vessels. But on the other hand, Islam also came from the south. Arab wars, paradoxically, contributed to the penetration of the Muslim faith in the Khazar lands. After all, war is not only battles, but also contacts, trade, cultural exchange. Arab merchants appeared in Khazar cities, told about their faith, married local women, stayed to live. Gradually, an influential Muslim community was formed in Etel. Moreover, Islam penetrated even into the Khazar army. The royal guard, which guarded the palace of the Khagan, consisted in large part of Muslims, mercenaries who were called Larisiyas. Imagine this picture. In the palace of the pagan, Khagan, are soldiers who 5 times a day face Mecca and read the surahs of the Quran. This was possible only in Hazaria, with its amazing tolerance to other people's beliefs. And then, in this colorful religious picture, there was an event that made Khazaria unique in world history. At the beginning of the 9th century, the ruling elite of the Khazars adopted Judaism. This decision was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that historians still argue about its causes and consequences. Imagine this scene. In a huge tent, decorated with carpets and gold, Khazar leaders gather. Before them stand representatives of 3 religions: a Christian priest in a dark cassock, a Muslim imam in a white dressing gown, a Jewish rabbi in a long kaftan. Each tells about his faith. Each tries to convince the Khazar rulers in the truth of their teachings. It was not just a religious choice. It was a geopolitical choice, a choice of which of the great civilizations to link their fate with. I chose Judaism. Why? Perhaps because it was the only way to maintain independence, not to bow to either Christian Byzantium or the Islamic Caliphate. Judaism was a religion without empire, a religion that carried no threat of political subjugation. Perhaps practical considerations also played a role. Jewish communities were important partners in international trade, and acceptance of their faith opened up new opportunities for trade relations. The key figure in this process was a military leader named Bulan, the founder of the dynasty that would rule Khazaria for the next centuries. His descendant Obadiah completed the work started by his grandfather, concentrating real power in his hands, and finally establishing Judaism as the religion of the Khazar elite. But it is important to understand, Judaism was accepted only by a narrow circle of the Khazar nobility. Ordinary Khazars, and even more so the peoples under their control, continued to practice their traditional religions. This was not a mass conversion. It was rather a political declaration of the ruling class. As a result, in Khazaria, there was a unique situation. a state where the Kagan professes Judaism, his guards, Islam, part of the subjects, Christianity, and the majority of the population remains faithful to the ancient pagan gods. This religious mosaic was not an obstacle to the development of Khazaria, but on the contrary, one of the sources of its strength. In Ital, there was a developed judicial system where each religion had its own judges. 7 judges administered justice in the capital of the Khaganate, and each community could count on a fair resolution of the dispute according to its laws and traditions. Imagine a market square in Itil at the height of a summer's day. The sun bakes mercilessly, but commerce is boiling. Here you can hear dozens of languages and see hundreds of different faces. Here is a Sogdian merchant in a silk dressing gown looking at furs brought by Slavic hunters from the northern forests. Nearby, a Jewish merchant weighs on an accurate scale silver dirhams received for a batch of honey. An Arab merchant haggles with a Khazar herdsman over the price of horses, the very steppe horses that were renowned for their endurance and speed. A little further away, in the shade of an awning, sits an old Chinese merchant, leisurely sipping tea and watching the bustle. In his caravan are silk and porcelain, tea and spices, lacquered boxes, and ivory. He has traveled thousands of miles, crossed deserts and mountains to get here, to Ital, where all the trade routes of the world meet. It was trade that was the main source of wealth of Khazaria. The Khaganate controlled the most important transit routes, the Great Silk Road, which connected China with Europe, the Volga trade route, through which the Scandinavian Vikings brought amber and furs to the Muslim world and received silver and silk in return. The Khazar lands were crossed by traders, Rachdanites, Jewish merchants who created the first global trade network in history, linking Spain with China, Scandinavia with India. The Khazars did not produce silk and spices, porcelain and precious stones, but they controlled the routes by which all this wealth flowed from the east to the west and back. For the right to pass through their territory, merchants paid duties, which formed the basis of the Khazar budget. This was a very modern economic model for those times, to live not at the expense of production, but at the expense of services, at the expense of creating conditions for trade. In Ital, beautiful caravanserais were built, i.e., inn houses for merchants, where one could not only spend the night and feed animals, but also meet with trading partners, conclude deals, and get information about prices in other cities. Here worked changers who exchanged various coins, Byzantine solidi, Arabian dirhams, Western European denarii. There were also warehouses where goods could be stored for months, waiting for a favorable market. Khazaria itself also produced goods for export. Horses were exported from the steppes, the very horses that Chinese emperors admired, and for which Arab caliphs were ready to pay in gold. From the Volga and the Caspian Sea, fish glue, which was highly valued in shipbuilding. From the northern forests, territories under the Khazars, honey, wax, furs, and, alas, slaves, prisoners of war captured in raids, who were sold at slave markets. But Khazaria traded not only material goods. It was a place of exchange of ideas, technology, and cultural achievements. Chinese inventions, compass, gunpowder, paper, reached Europe through the Khazar lands. From here, European handicrafts, Scandinavian amber, Slavic honey, went to the Muslim world. Khazar translators translated from one language to another not only trade documents, but also scientific treatises, religious texts, and poetic works. Sogdian, the language of a people who lived in the oases of Central Asia and mediated trade between China and the West, played a special role in this cultural exchange. Sogdian was the lingua franca of the early medieval world, the language of international communication, like Latin in Europe or Arabic in the Muslim world. Sogdian was the language of correspondence between merchants from Spain to Korea. Contracts were written, and trade documents were drawn up. Sogdian colonists lived in Ital, bringing with them not only trade skills, but also a high culture. The Sogdians were skilled craftsmen. They could make fine fabrics, jewelry, and metal utensils. They were educated people. Among them were doctors, astronomers, mathematicians. They professed different religions: Buddhism, Christianity, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism. And this religious tolerance fit perfectly into the general atmosphere of the Khazar capital. Gradually, Ital turned into one of the largest cities of the early medieval world. According to various estimates, it was inhabited by from 100 to 200,000 people, a huge figure for that time, comparable to the population of Constantinople or Baghdad. The city grew, expanded, occupied more and more islands in the Volga Delta. New neighborhoods, workshops, palaces of the nobility were built. Archaeologists still argue about the exact location of Itil. The river has changed its course over the past centuries. The level of the Caspian Sea fluctuated, and the city could have been flooded or hidden by sediments. But in recent years, in the area of villages Semibugri and Barani Bugur in the Astrakhan region, were found remains of settlements, which may be the ruins of the great Khazar capital. Thousands of fragments of pottery, remains of fortress walls, traces of workshops and dwellings, everything that points to the existence of a large city. Imagine what this city might have looked like in its heyday. In the morning, when the mist rises from the water, you can see the silhouettes of mosques and synagogues, Christian churches and pagan shrines. Smoke rises from the chimneys of workshops where iron is forged, cloth is woven, and crockery is molded. The streets are lined with caravans of camels, the rustling of horses in the horse market, and the shouts of traders offering their goods. And in the northern part of the city, separated from the commercial quarter by a wide channel, stands the palace of the Kagan, the center of the mysterious power that unites this motley, multilingual population into a single state. Imagine this palace at the hour of sunset. Reddish golden light is reflected in the windows. Guards in shining armor stand motionless at the gates. And somewhere in the depths of the building, in chambers hung with precious carpets, sits a man whose power stretches from the Dnieper to the Caspian Sea, but who hardly ever leaves the walls of his residence. The Kagan is not just a ruler, but a living embodiment of divine power, a sacred figure on whose health and well-being depends the prosperity of the whole country. His life is subject to a strict ritual. He rises at certain times, eats certain foods, receives visitors on certain days. He cannot be seen too often. It can destroy his sacral power. He hardly speaks in public. His words are too important to be spent on everyday matters. And in this paradoxical situation, when the formal head of state is practically excluded from the real governance, the full extent of executive power is concentrated in his hands. Bek, king, as he was called in Hebrew, Melech. If the Kagan is a symbol, the Bek is an action. If the Kagan embodies tradition, the Bek is responsible for innovation. If the Kagan connects the state with the higher powers, the Bek solves earthly problems. Imagine a morning in Bek's office. It is early in the morning, when the city is still asleep, and the sun is just beginning to turn the waters of the Volga golden. On the table laid out maps, primitive by our standards, but containing all the information known at that time about the subject lands. Here are marked fortresses, where Khazar garrisons stand, trade routes along which caravans go, borders beyond which the possessions of neighboring states begin. Ambassadors enter, a Byzantine diplomat in rich clothes, accustomed to the splendor of the Constantinople court, an Arab emissary representing the interests of the Baghdad Caliph, a Bulgarian boyar speaking on behalf of the Danubian king, a Slavic prince from distant Kiev, not yet aware that his descendants will become the grave diggers of Khazar power. Each of them wants something from Khazaria, an alliance against common enemies, trade privileges, military assistance. Beck listens to everyone calmly, weighing every word. He knows that any decision he makes can have consequences that will reverberate years and decades later. Khazaria exists in a complex balance of power, and the slightest miscalculation can disrupt it. Therefore, Khazar diplomacy has always been the art of the possible, not to strive for the maximum, but to achieve the optimum. Relations with the Byzantine Empire were particularly delicate. These two states were natural allies. They were separated by thousands of kilometers. They had no territorial disputes, but they had a common enemy in the form of the Arab Caliphate. Byzantium needed a Khazar bulwark to protect its northern borders from nomadic raids. Khazaria was interested in Byzantine gold, Byzantine handicrafts, Byzantine technology. This alliance was cemented not only by political treaties, but also by dynastic marriages. In 732nd year, the future Byzantine Emperor Constantine V married the daughter of the Khazar Hagan Virkor, a princess who in Constantinople began to be called Irina, but whose Khazar name, Chichak, meant simply flower. Imagine this wedding. In the golden palace of Constantinople, under the arches of Hagia Sophia, Byzantine prince takes a steppe princess as wife, and somewhere far away, in Itil, Khazar Khagan receives the news that his daughter became a member of the imperial family of the greatest Christian empire of the world. But the alliance with Byzantium did not prevent the Khazars from maintaining relations with other forces. When the interests of the state required it, the Khazars could support the opponents of the Byzantine emperor, help to overthrow him, or, conversely, help to return to the throne. The policy of the Khazars has always been pragmatic. They supported those who were favorable to them at the moment, without binding themselves with long-term commitments. The basis of Khazar power was the army, not numerous by the standards of great empires, but perfectly organized and mobile. It was based on the ancient steppe militia. All adult male Khazars were warriors, able in case of need to get on a horse and go on a campaign. This militia could reach the number of 100 or 300,000 people, an impressive figure, but such an army could be gathered only in exceptional cases, when the very existence of the state was threatened. Imagine such a gathering. Horsemen fly across the steppe with the order of the Khagan about the general militia. In every Khazar village, men saddle their horses, take bows and sabers, say goodbye to their wives and children. In a few days, the steppe is covered with dust from thousands of hooves. To the appointed place of gathering, are moving detachments from all parts of the Khaganate. This sight must have amazed contemporaries. A sea of horsemen stretching from horizon to horizon. But over time, as Khazaria became more and more settled state, the militia system began to be supplemented by professional military units. They were based on heavy mounted guards, riders in chainmail, armed with long spears and swords, capable of delivering a crushing blow to the enemy. Many of these guardsmen were not Khazars by origin. Among them were Muslims, Laresians, Slavic, and Russian mercenaries, representatives of other peoples who served the Khazar Khagan for a salary. The main weapon of the Khazar warrior was the bow, a traditional weapon of the steppe people, which they wielded to perfection. The Khazar bow was composite, made of several layers of wood, bone, and tendons glued with fish glue. Such a bow was compact, but very powerful. An arrow from it could pierce the chainmail at a distance of 100 paces. Khazar horsemen could shoot at full gallop, hitting targets with incredible accuracy. In addition to bows, the Khazars used swords, sabers, spears, and battle axes. But unlike many other nomadic peoples, they were able not only to fight in the open field, but also to take fortified cities. They had siege machines, catapults, and battering rams. They knew how to build siege towers and dig up walls. This indicates a high level of military organization and technical knowledge. One of the most famous Khazar fortresses was Sarkal, the White Fortress, built on the Don with the help of Byzantine engineers. Imagine this construction. White limestone walls rise to a height of several fathoms. Corner towers allow you to fire at the approaches to the fortress. Inside, there are barracks for the garrison, warehouses for weapons and food. Sarkal controlled the crossing of the Don, the most important junction on the road from Europe to Asia. Another important fortress was Samkurts, located near the Kerch Strait. From here, the Khazars controlled the exit from the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea, collected duties from merchant ships, made sure that no one could pass this way without their permission. These fortresses were not just military structures. They were symbols of Khazar power, a reminder that the Khaganate controlled all the most important routes between Europe and Asia. But as decades and then centuries passed, the situation in Eastern Europe gradually changed. In the north, in the forest zone, Slavic tribes were gaining strength. For a long time, they were tributaries of the Khazars. They paid tribute with furs and honey, wax and slaves. Khazar tax collectors regularly came to Slavic settlements, and no one dared to oppose them. But in the 9th century, a new force appeared among the Slavic tribes, the Varangians, Norman warriors, and traders from Scandinavia. They came from the north, by river, on their long rooks, and brought with them not only iron swords and battle experience, but also new ideas about state power. Under their leadership, the disparate Slavic tribes began to unite into a single state, the old Russian state. Imagine a meeting between a Khazar tribute collector and a Slavic prince with Varangian warriors behind him. Before, the Khazar could demand, and they obeyed him without objection. Now the Slavic prince looks him in the eye and says, "We will no longer pay tribute. If you want to fight, fight." And behind his shoulders gleam the swords of professional warriors who know no fear and are ready to fight to the last drop of blood. The first clashes between the Khazars and Russians took place within the framework of traditional relations. One of the Slavic tribes refused to pay tribute. The Khazars sent a punitive detachment. After several battles, the rebels were subdued or bought off. But gradually, these conflicts became more and more serious. Russians did not just refuse to pay tribute. They themselves began to claim the role of tribute collectors from neighboring tribes. In the year 913, there was an episode that showed that times were changing. The Russian fleet traveled down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. For the first time in history, someone dared to pass through the main waterway of Khazaria without the permission of the Khazar Khagan. Russian rooks reached the Caspian Sea, raided coastal towns, captured rich booty. On the way back, the Khazars ambushed them at the mouth of the Volga. Most of the Russian army died, but the very fact of such a campaign was an ominous omen. It was not just a raid, it was a battlefield reconnaissance. The Russians were checking how strong the Khazar power over the Volga route was, how effective the Khazar military machine was. And although this time the Khazars were victorious, the very fact that someone dared to challenge them on their own territory spoke volumes. And from the south came alarming news of new nomadic peoples who were moving westwards from the depths of Asia. The Badjanaks, the Oghuz, and later the Polovtsians. This was a new wave of the great migration of peoples, and it threatened to sweep away the old state formations, including Khazaria. The steppe was again in motion, and in this movement, the old settled states were at a disadvantage. The Badjanaks were especially dangerous. They were a numerous and warlike people, accustomed to constant wars and raids. They did not want to submit to the Khazars, as the former nomadic tribes did. On the contrary, they themselves claimed dominance in the Black Sea steppes. The Khazars had to leave many of their positions in the northern Black Sea region, retreat to more protected borders. This retreat had far-reaching consequences. Khazaria lost control over important parts of trade routes, lost revenues from customs duties, And most importantly, it was losing prestige. Vassal nations saw that the Khazars could not even protect themselves and began to wonder, is it worth it to continue to obey them? At the same time, changes were also taking place in Khazaria itself. The adoption of Judaism by the ruling elite, no matter how politically wise it was at the time of its fulfillment, in time began to create problems. Most of the population of the Khaganate practiced other religions: Christianity, Islam, various pagan cults. And gradually, there was a feeling that the rulers had become estranged from their people, had become strangers. This was not an open conflict. The Khazar Khagans never tried to forcibly convert their subjects to Judaism. On the contrary, they maintained the religious tolerance that had always characterized their state. But the delicate bond between the power and the people, which is based on common beliefs, common traditions, common understanding of the world, was gradually weakening. Meanwhile, the old Russian state was gaining strength in the north. Kiev was ruled by princes who were not content with the role of tributaries of the Khazar Khagan. They themselves wanted to become collectors of tribute, masters of trade routes, rulers of Slavic tribes. And they had a serious basis for this: a growing military force based on a combination of Slavic numbers with Varangian military training. Imagine the retinue of a Russian prince of that time. It is no longer a militia of peasants summoned to war, but professional warriors for whom war is a trade and a way of life. They are beautifully armed. Each has a sword, shield, spear, or battle axe. They wear ringlets, helmets, leather armor. They know how to fight on foot, on horseback, and on rooks. They are used to long campaigns, to life in a military camp, to constant danger. And this force, this new military machine created by the Russian princes, is directed against Khazaroya. Not immediately, not in one decisive blow. At first, it is separate skirmishes, border conflicts, disputes about who has the right to collect tribute from this or that tribe. But gradually, the conflict grows, and it becomes clear that there is not enough room in Eastern Europe for two great powers. And so, in the 965th year from the Nativity of Christ, came the moment which was so long awaited and which was so feared. The young Kiev prince Sviatoslav Igorovich, who received his name in honor of glory and light, decided to strike a decisive blow to the Khazar power. Imagine this man. He is still quite young, full of energy and ambition, dreams of glory that will survive the centuries. Behind his shoulders, the experience of successful campaigns against the Volga Bulgarians. Ahead, the dream of creating a great empire from the Danube to the Volga. Sviatoslav gathers an army, not only his Kievan retinue, but also warriors of allied Slavic tribes, Varangian mercenaries, Pecheneg horsemen. This is not just a raid for tribute. It is a war of annihilation, the desire to once and for all end the Khazar domination in Eastern Europe. Imagine this army, thousands of warriors moving along the steppe roads, raising dust to the sky. In front, mounted scouts. In the center, a foot squad under the prince's flags. On the flanks, allied detachments of Pechenegs on fast steppe horses. The meeting took place somewhere in the Don steppes, not far from the Khazar fortress of Sarkel. Imagine this picture. It is early morning. The fog is still drifting over the steppe grass, but the sun is already rising, promising a hot day. On the hill, you can see the banners of the Khazar army, warriors in chainmail, riders on stunted but hardy steppe horses, commanders in rich armor. This is the army which for centuries brought fear to the enemies of the Khazar Khagan, an army that has never known defeat in its own land. But times have changed. Khazar army is no longer what it was before. A lot of professional warriors, but little of that steppe fervor, that willingness to die for their native land, which once made the Khazars invincible. And Sviatoslav's army burns with a thirst for battle, desire for glory and booty. Battle was cruel, but not long. Khazar orders trembled, then ran. Sarkel fell. Its white walls were destroyed. The garrison partly killed, partly taken prisoner, but it was only the beginning. Sviatoslav did not limit himself to the capture of one fortress. He decided to strike at the very heart of the Khazar state. His army moved to the east, to the Volga, to Ityl, the very capital, which for centuries was a symbol of Khazar power. Imagine this campaign. Russian rooks go down the Volga, and on the banks is moving mounted army. The local population in horror flees, throwing houses and property. The news of Sviatoslav's approach flies faster than he himself, sowing panic in Khazar towns and villages. And now, Ityl, the great capital, which seemed impregnable, opens before the Russian army. The city is located on islands, surrounded by water, has powerful fortifications. But the defenders no longer have the same spirit. The news of the defeat of the army at Sarkel demoralized them. In addition, many residents of the city, merchants, artisans, servants, are not ready to die for the Khazar power. The main thing for them is to save their lives and property. And who will rule? The Khazar Hagan or the Russian prince is not so important. Ityl has fallen. Imagine this picture. Russian soldiers burst into a city that had been inaccessible to enemies for centuries. They go through the streets where not so long ago there was speech in dozens of languages, where merchants from all parts of the known world traded. Now these streets are empty. Who could, fled. Who did not have time, hid in the houses, hoping to wait out the storm. The palace of the Kagan has been ransacked. Imagine these chambers where the lord of a huge empire sat not so long ago, surrounded by ceremonial splendor, precious carpets, gold and silver vessels, silk fabrics, rare books. All this is now in the hands of the victors. The Kagan himself, if he is still alive, has fled somewhere into the swamps of the Volga Delta, where it is still possible to hide from pursuit. But Sviatoslav did not limit himself to Ital. His army moved further, to Semender, the ancient capital of the Khazars in the foothills of Dagestan. And this city suffered the same fate. Semender was taken, plundered. Its inhabitants were partly killed, partly converted into slavery. The two capitals of Khazaria lay in ruins, and their conqueror received a nickname, under which he went down in history: Sviatoslav the Brave. It would seem to be the end. The great empire of the Khazars fell under the blows of the Russian prince, its cities destroyed, its army defeated. And indeed, as an independent state, Khazar Khaganate ceased to exist. But history rarely ends with one decisive battle. Life is more complicated than heroic tales. Sviatoslav could not stay long in the conquered lands. Other wars and other conquests were waiting for him. The Byzantium emperor called it on Danube, promising gold for war with Bulgarian. And Russian prince has left, having left in Khazar lands only small garrisons. And the Khazars, who had taken refuge in the swamps and reeds of the Volga Delta, gradually began to return. The Khaganate was dead, but the Khazars as a people continued to exist. They rebuilt some of the destroyed cities, tried to establish trade, looked for allies. From Khwarezm came help, troops and money, counselors and craftsmen. Many Khazars at this time converted to Islam. Perhaps this was a condition of Khwarezmian aid, or perhaps an attempt to find a new unifying idea to replace the lost greatness. But the former power was no longer there. Khazaria disintegrated into several small principalities. Crimean Khazaria, which existed the longest, Don, North Caucasus, Volga. Each of them controlled a small territory, lived its own life, trying to survive in a changed world. The last blow was struck in 985 by Prince Vladimir, the grandfather of the very Vladimir who baptized Russia. he made a new campaign against the Khazars and imposed a tribute on them. After that, the Khazars are occasionally mentioned in chronicles, but already as an insignificant force, unable to influence the course of major events. The final point in the history of the Khazar principalities was set by the Mongols in the 13th century. Batu Khan's troops traveled through all the lands where the descendants of the Khazars still lived and incorporated them into the Golden Horde. Khazars dissolved among other peoples. Their language was forgotten. Their traditions were mixed with foreign ones. Only archaeological finds and references in ancient chronicles remind that once there was a great empire between the Dnieper and the Caspian Sea. But why did Khazaria perish? Why did the state, which for 7 centuries controlled vast territories, successfully fought with the Arabs, built cities, and developed trade, eventually fell under the blows of a relatively small Russian army? Historians still argue about it, put forward different versions. But apparently, there were several reasons, and all of them acted simultaneously. Firstly, the international situation changed. The Great Silk Road, which for centuries had brought Khazaria huge revenues from trade duties, began to lose its importance. Sea trade became more and more important, and overland caravan routes less and less profitable. Arab wars in Central Asia, feuds in China, the emergence of new sea routes, all this undermined the foundations of Khazar prosperity. Secondly, internal contradictions were accumulating in Khazaria itself. The adoption of Judaism by the ruling elite, however wise it may have been initially, over time created a gap between the elite and the people. The majority of Khazars continued to practice traditional beliefs or accepted Christianity and Islam, but not Judaism. This deprived the state of the unifying power provided by a common religion. Thirdly, the very nature of warfare had changed. The time of large, mounted armies, which could decide the outcome of the war with a single battle, was a thing of the past. There were new types of troops, new tactics, new weapons. Khazars, accustomed to the old methods of warfare, were not ready for these changes. Finally, it was simply bad luck with the enemy. Sviatoslav was a talented commander, his army well-trained and motivated. If the Khazars had to face a less capable opponent, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But history doesn't know the subjunctive mood, or maybe it was what the great Russian historian Lev Gumilev wrote about: climate change. The 10th century was a time of cooling, crop failures, environmental disasters. The level of the Caspian Sea was rising, and Ital could be simply flooded. Steppes became less suitable for nomadic cattle breeding. The population went to more favorable areas. Khazar elite pampered by centuries of peaceful life, could not adapt to the changed conditions. Perhaps all these reasons acted together, creating the crisis that led to the death of the Khaganate. But be that as it may, by the end of the 10th century, from the great Khazar Empire remained only memories and archaeological monuments, which are still studied by scientists. And for more than 1,000 years, archaeologists have been searching for traces of the vanished civilization. Especially interesting is the search for Itil, the legendary capital that was one of the largest cities of the early medieval world. Somewhere in the Volga Delta, under a layer of silt and sand, must lie the remains of palaces and temples, workshops and dwellings, household items, and works of art. In recent years, archaeologists have focused their efforts on the area around the villages of Semibugri and Barani Bugor in the Astrakhan region. Thousands of fragments of pottery from the Saltovo-Mayak culture, the same culture that was typical of the Khazar Khaganate, have been found here. Remains of fortress walls made of raw brick. Traces of workshops and dwellings were found. Perhaps these are the ruins of Itil, but only further research will give the final answer. And in distant Kiev, in the area of modern Lviv Square, archaeologists are looking for traces of the Zidovsky city, the Khazar trading post that existed in the old Russian capital. Thousands of Arab coins, remains of fortifications, which have analogies with Khazar monuments, were found here. Perhaps it was the fortress of Sambatas, which was mentioned by the Byzantine emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus. Modern science opens new pages of Khazar history. Geneticists have studied remains from Khazar burials and found that the Khazars were a people of mixed origin. They combined Mongoloid and Caucasoid features. Most of them had brown eyes and dark hair, dark skin, a look typical of steppe nomads. This is confirmed by written sources, which described the Khazars as a people who combined features of different ethnic groups. Historians continue to study the Khazar correspondence, those amazing documents that have come down to us from the depths of centuries. Khazar kings corresponded with the Jewish communities of Spain, telling about their country, their faith, their problems. These letters are an invaluable source of information about the life of the medieval state, seen from the inside. The study of Khazaria has become a separate scientific discipline, Khazar studies. Scientists from different countries, Russia, USA, Israel, Germany, exchange data, conduct joint research, publish monographs and articles. And gradually, the picture of the life of the disappeared civilization, no less interesting and complex than many other states of the early Middle Ages, is being restored. Khazar Khaganate was a unique phenomenon in world history, a state where representatives of different peoples and religions coexisted peacefully, where trade was more important than war, where diplomacy was valued above the power of arms. Perhaps that is why it died. Peace is always fragile. Tolerance requires strength for its defense. And when there is not enough strength, simpler and crueler solutions win. But the memory of Khazaria lives on. In the names of rivers and cities, in archaeological finds, in the genetic memory of peoples who once lived under the rule of the Khazar Khagans. And every time we say that peaceful coexistence of different cultures is possible, that trade is better than war, that diplomacy is more effective than violence, we are, to some extent, continuing the Khazar tradition. So ends our story about the vanished empire of the Khazars, a state that 7 centuries ago controlled vast areas from the Dnieper to the Caspian Sea, and then dissolved into the mists of time, leaving behind only vague legends and archaeological finds. But isn't that the fate of all empires? Doesn't history teach us that everything in this world is transient? That even the most powerful states, sooner or later, become the property of the past? Good night, my dear listeners. May your dreams be lucid, and tomorrow bring new discoveries and new stories. See you in the next edition of our Cozy Podcast, where we will again go on a journey through the mysterious pages of the past.